Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome everybody into this afternoon's webinar. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the configurable elements relative to estimates and repair orders, and really as it relates to adding parts and labor onto a transaction. So what we're going to really talk about, I've got an estimate up here for my friend Tony Pierce, his 2006 Ford Taurus. If you've watched the level 1 video that talks about the adding parts and labor onto our transaction, we added all of these different items onto our transaction earlier as we were building this ticket for Tony Pierce. So we're looking at really as we're adding on labor lines or adding part lines onto a transaction, what are some of the configurable options? The first place we're going to start is actually to talk about the service requests tab. As we looked at or talked about the service requests tab earlier, this is a way that we can add elements onto a transaction. So as we want to add on jobs that we're using consistently as part of the intake process, primarily designed for a diagnostic and or inspection type items. So our courtesy check or our brake evaluation, our engine diag work, to quickly add that onto a ticket as a customer comes through the door. So if you're using the service requests functionality, again, that's what we're using, or that's what that's intended to be used for. You've got this drop-down menu in here for our customer requests. So again, this is intended to be that easy way to add on those items that we're hearing from customers consistently, or make sure that we add on a similar note within each transaction. So as we're looking at our service requests window, and really all of the different items that we're going to talk about through our configuration conversation, those get done over on the configuration side of life. So I'm going to click on the configuration module, and as that opens up, if you're not familiar with configuration, what I typically tell users is 95% of the time, if not more, that you come into configuration, you're going to be changing things underneath the configuration menu. Again, most of the things on the other menus aren't used very frequently. So underneath our configuration menu, we get a whole bunch of different items that we have an opportunity to select from. In this case, what we're looking to do is change the behavior of a repair order. So I'm going to go over to where it says repair order, and in the window that opens up in the on the right-hand side. So we're going to go through our list, and in my first example, the first topic of conversation is going to be all the way almost to the very bottom where it says service request options. Now again, this window looks a little bit different in Gen 2 than it does in Gen 1. The primary difference being in Gen 2, as opposed to limiting you to 6 different options, because we've now turned it into a scroll, you can go ahead and you can have as many different options as you'd like. On the Gen 1 configuration, again, what you'd have is at the top, the 6 different options. You'll select a labor category and a labor operation, as well as define what the button says. In Gen 2, again, the difference really is you can have as many as you'd like. So the configuration screen, a little bit different. Again, what you'll notice is here's the service. So again, when I say here's the service, this is what what it says in my drop-down box or in my scroll bar. This is the labor category and the labor operation that we're going to use. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to take some of these off of here. So if I highlighted one and hit delete, it asks if I'd like to delete these services. So again, you can see I can remove those, and or if I wanted to add a new one into my list, all I'll do on the left-hand side is click on add. I apologize. Let's do this. Let's add my courtesy check back in. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to define what it says. I'm going to, in my list, define the labor category and the labor operation that it's going to perform. And then one of the other new things with Gen 2 is that you have an opportunity to tell it that this is a required service, meaning each time I start a transaction, will it automatically have this pre-selected? So as I click on post labor, it's already going to get added by default as we go through. When I click on add, now it's in my list along with the rest. And again, the main difference between Gen 1 and Gen 2 is Gen 1, you'd have 6 lines pre-established. There wouldn't be an opportunity to add more than 6 as you go through. But the baseline functionality from there would be the same. Towards the bottom, here are our service requests. So again, this list here, starting with air conditioning, blows warm air, check and advise, correlates to this list here, where it says air conditioning, blows warm air, check and advise. Now the title and or the number that gets associated, in this case it's called the request title, simply defines the sequence or the order. So they're in alphanumeric sequence based upon we've got as the request title. This is what's going to go onto a customer's transaction if we were to use this from our drop-down menu. Now, the configuration of this window a little bit different or unique than a lot of the configuration screens. Again, not inherently obvious how we would add and or remove from this window. Certainly changing is easy enough. Just come into the box that you want to change and add in whatever text you would like. But if I wanted to remove one, what you do is you actually left click on the line on the bottom, the gray box on the left-hand side, which then highlights the entire line, and then hit the delete key on your keyboard. So it's made that line go away. If I'd like to add a new one in, we want to add in AC2, and then in this case, the comment is going to be, air conditioning not blowing, not cold enough. And again, we'll add that in to our list. Once I'm done typing, I simply click into any other box, which then locks in that change. And then now it doesn't immediately show up over here, meaning if I looked in my drop-down list, those still look the same. However, when I close that window and then open it back up again, as I get into my window here, and then went back over to the service request tab, and now what I'll see is, well, there's I've gotten rid of the line 1 and I've added in the AC2. So again, you can see also the courtesy check now shows up here with a check mark as a required entry down there. If I was to click on post labor, both the engine diag and the courtesy check getting added onto our transaction down there towards the bottom. So again, the first conversation as it relates to configuration, parts, and labor and adding those onto transactions comes up as we look at the service requests tab. There is one more setting that's relevant to that conversation. It's back in configuration. I'm going to go back underneath the configuration header, down to repair order, and then over to RO options. Again, for those of you that aren't familiar, the RO options window is one of the primary ways that controls kind of the workflow, the boxes that appear where we go from step 1 to step 2 and the rest. Relevant to this conversation is this setting in the upper left-hand corner where it says start with service requests. If that box is unchecked, as I start a new transaction, I just automatically by default land on my parts and labor tab. The concept here was we didn't always have that service requests tab. It was added, I don't know, quite a few versions ago, but it wasn't there as part of the original design. So users got used to and or comfortable with just starting on the parts and labor tab. As we added the service request tab, we encourage that again to help facilitate the customer intake process. But if we didn't want to start on that tab, we wanted to start on the parts and labor. Again, that is a configurable setting as we go through. The next conversation as we look at some of the configurable elements relative to parts and labor has to do with our labor rate. You'll notice I've got 4 different labor rates. In my case, they're all at $85 an hour. As we're adding jobs onto a transaction, again, we have the opportunity to define up to 4 different labor rates inside of the system underneath configuration. If I go down to labor, the very first item in my menu that opens says labor rates. When I come in here, again, you'll notice in my case, I'm at $85 across the board. So even though it says skill level A, B, C, and D, we have all of them set at the same value. Now, certainly I could vary my labor rates. Now, you'll notice skill level A, B, C, and D. What those A, B, C, and D do is they correlate to the concepts of the labor guides, meaning if you were to look at an all data to see the labor times, or you were to look at an Epicor, which uses Mitchell labor times, you'll notice that they assign a difficulty or a skill level. And it's A, B, C, or D, D being the easiest, so let's say replacing a battery, A being the most difficult, how about rebuilding a transmission? But as they're assigning not just a labor time, they also are defining, here's what skill level would be required. So if you wanted to vary your labor based upon how skilled the technician should have to be to perform a job, you can, again, A, B, C, or D. What I see these used more commonly for would be, well, you know what, I want to be at $100 an hour. That's my base labor rate. But for engine diagnostic work, for electrical work, and for AC, again, let's just say, for example, I would be at 120 bucks an hour. Well, then I could have skill level A be 100, skill level B be 120. And you know what, I've got a guy down the street banging out exhaust for 80 bucks an hour. If I want to be competitive on exhaust, I need to have an $80 labor job in there as well. So again, you can change that labor rate. And then we get into the configuration of a labor operation here a little bit later on in this webinar, we'll look at where we can assign that labor rate to each individual line. Now I said $100 as my base labor rate. Oops, not 1,000, how about just 100? 120 for my engine diag or my AC work, and then 80 bucks an hour for my exhaust. You know, I don't have a specific value for this one, but I'm gonna just set it to my base rate just in case anything was already pre-assigned to it. And then I'll go ahead and click on OK. But it recognizes that we've changed that labor rate. So it's essentially asking us if we'd like to change the labor rate of each job from $85 to $100 an hour. So what it's essentially saying is if the job was pre-configured with the old rate A, should I change it to the new rate A? So if I say yes, then it's going to change them all to $100 an hour. Now, because we all started in the same place, then the questions are going to be seemingly redundant, because should I change 85 to 120? Well, we just changed 85 to 100. So realistically, how I answer this question is irrelevant. But let's say the next time we go to change, we change from 100 to 105, 120 to 125. Then again, questions will be a little bit more meaningful as we go through. In our case, we can answer yes to all of these as we go along. And now it's changing our labor rate. If we're using parts to drive labor, and more about that conversation as we get into talking about inventory and or parts in our inventory, should we change the calculations there as well? If I'm changing my rate, no reason I wouldn't do the same. I said yes to that question. And it says, would you like to recalculate the charge when updating the rate? This is the most important of all the questions, in that, let's say we had a job that was 5/10 of an hour, and my labor rate was previously $85 an hour. So if the math worked, 5.5 times 85 works out to be $42.50. We've now changed our labor rate to $100. Essentially what it's asking is, should this leave the price at $42.50, or should it redo the math? Half an hour times $100 to be $50. If I say no to this question, then the system will not redo the math, and the pricing for each job will be left as is. If I say yes, then again, as I said before, it's going to redo the math, and then now it's going to change the selling price. In my case, we'll say yes to the question to update the rate, and then now I've made my changes to my labor rate as it goes through. So it finished updating my labor rate. So again, the second piece of our conversation about configuring parts and labor as it relates to establishing those labor rates. The third place is as we go to add jobs onto a transaction. So I clicked on the labor icon up here in the upper left-hand corner, and you have a drop-down box of the not only categories, but also a drop-down box of what we call the operations. So again, we're going to do oil changes, and then underneath my oil changes, I've got a bunch of different oil change operations as we go through. So configuring both of those, again, a user definable setting as we go along. Take a look at a couple of the ones that we've added to our ticket for Mr. Pierce, specifically the oil change and also the auto transmission fluid exchange. You can get there either by using the plus keys on the right-hand side of this window here, and or back to configuration. We're now heading underneath the labor menu. In the labor menu, we'll start out with categories. So when I pick on categories, if you look through my drop-down list, here is my existing list of categories. So if I said, well, let's pick on oil changes. As I look at oil changes, you'll notice there is a category code. We no longer allow you to change that category code, or I'm sorry, we would not have ever wanted you to change that category code. For historical reporting purposes and for invoices in history, those are actually very important as we go through. The category code is an abbreviation that we use, again, for those reporting and historical purposes. It's not something that you'll see in use in the actual point of sale, but we do ask you to establish a category code for each. Underneath that, our category, the name, is what shows up in the drop-down box. On the right-hand side where it says our writer active versus inactive, if I had a category that I didn't want available at the front counter, I could make it inactive, and then now it removes from my list. Now, so if I say, well, let's see, we're going to establish a summer maintenance special category, and I'm going to have a whole bunch of different jobs in there that'll be applicable when I run my summer maintenance promotions. And when it's done, then I want that category to be removed. I don't want the guys at the front counter to be able to grab that. So again, make it active versus inactive. And then down there where it says service category is a way that we're allowing shops to potentially compare apples to oranges. And what I mean by that is through an animal that we're building called central service. This would be a way that for shops that have different configurations, they could assign a service category. And it says, even if I've got an oil change category at one location and I've got 5 different categories for oil changes, one for standard, semi-synthetic, high mileage, diesel, full synthetic, they could still compare one versus the other through what we call central service. So service category doesn't have an impact at point of sale, but it's for reporting purposes, again, through a tool in the background that we're offering called central service. So we wanted to add a new category. Again, I'm looking at an existing category, but if I wanted to add a category for, let's say we're going to segregate our high mileage oil changes into their own category, I'd click on add, and in this case, we'll make it OCH for high mileage oil changes or oil change high mile. And again, we're limited at least a bit in terms of how many characters we get. And in this case, we'll call it, how about oil change high mile? So all I have to do is establish that code and the category and then click on save. And now we've added in that category. So great, we can assign the categories or build, modify, or inactivate existing categories underneath each to where we'd go look at what we call our operations. So I'm going to go ahead and go into my labor operations. And again, here's my category for oil changes. As I'm looking at a labor operation, in my listing or my drop down, we'll pick on our 5W30 full service oil change. So we've got our category oil change, our operation code. The operation code really serves 2 purposes. First is it defines the sequence, meaning these are not in alphabetical order like the categories are. They're defined in their sequence by the operation code. It's also historically how we would count the instance of use. What I mean by that is, let's say we go and we run, we'll call the sales by labor operation report. And we say how many, wheel alignments did we do in this particular time frame. It's counting the category and operation code. So WA is my category code for wheel alignment, 100 for the operation. So that's how it knows consistently that that was always the job. If I all of a sudden change that operation code to, let's say, 101, then now historically it won't be able to make the transition one versus the other. So we typically recommend don't change the operation codes once they've been established, and or if you do, just understand that it will have a little bit of a historical impact on reporting. It will not hurt any invoice in history. They contained whatever description they contained with that day that they were closed. But again, from a reporting perspective, well, we may have to just look at it a little differently once we've made the change than we did prior to making the change. Whether this individual job is active or inactive, out there to the right-hand side, so we can see that in this case, we're going to have this job be active. As you look down towards the bottom, here's a bunch of other elements that we can include as part of this particular labor operation. Most important, to the right-hand corner, where it says the time, in this case, the rate, which recalculated my charge, but this is a package at $32.99. And oh, by the way, for existing jobs inside of the system, you can either lock them, meaning they'll always be $32.99. You can lock them with a price minimum, meaning they'll always be at least $32.99. Users can change it to a higher value. Or in my case, I've got them unlocked, means that somebody has the option or ability to change not only the charge, but the package price as we go through. If you lock something, or if you lock it with a price minimum, when we add it to a ticket, it will come up with an override, meaning if I've got a certain security level, I could still change that price point, because we realize there will be a necessity when that becomes, something that has to get done. But we're going to lock it so that just the general users would have to get someone with a certain authority level to do so. When I'm doing the math, if I should calculate the charge based upon the time or calculate the time, so again, which way does the math get done? That times this or this divided by that as we go through. This job should be a sublet job, so as we're looking at not only reporting, but posting accounts payable. If we want to add this on and this becomes what we call a menu service, so for certain reports for labor, menu services counted in a different section or differently as we go along, intended to indicate jobs that might be part of a bigger whole, if you will. No fees means that as I do this service, I won't use this calculation in our supply charge calculations. And in my case, labor is taxable. If you're using our integrated oil sticker printer, so we want to go ahead and we want to have the system generate that 2 by 1.5 inch oil sticker, window cling oil sticker It goes in the upper left-hand corner. You can have the system prompt as this job gets added onto our transaction. On the left-hand side where it says parts kit, we're going to change this one in just a moment, because what a parts kit does is it allows you to say, whenever we add on this job, I want you to automatically bring over this part. This is always going to be part of this job. So don't ever force me to add it. Just always add this as we go along. If we're using the Epic or catalog and we wanted to give ourselves an opportunity to check book time labor, for this we could use the labor lookup functionality. And down in the lower left-hand corner, Breakout Labor on Sale Summary Report. Again, for those that are familiar with the summary report, there's a section in the upper left-hand corner, both underneath the sales and the profit section, where you can break out certain line items into their own calculation. So again, it's most commonly used for tires, but you configure it at the labor operation level. So again, some of the different configurable options as far as the jobs are concerned. I did say we wanted to add on a parts kit along with this. That's done differently. That drop-down menu isn't configured directly from in that window there, but this time it's a parts kit, so it lives under parts, then down to parts kits. Now we're going to do a webinar specifically about using parts kits as well as configuring them. So we're not going to get too deep into configuring a parts kit, but in this case, we're going to add a new kit. The kit name is just going to be 5W30 oil, because that's the name of the kit. That's how I'll find it in my drop-down list. So once I create it, I'll click on Save. It wants to know, well, what's the part number that we're going to use? And my part number for 5W30 oil is .oil and then 5W30. And I'd like to have it add 5, because that's what my base oil change package includes, is up to 5 quarts of oil. So we click on OK, and we've now created that part kit. I could now go back underneath configuration, down to labor, and then over to operations. And I can tell the system that for that job, again, my category was oil changes. My job was my 530 full service oil change. I would like to automatically add on 5W30 oil as the parts kit that we include. So once I click on Save, if I was to now go back and add that job onto a ticket again, and again, it's up here at the top, I'm going to take it back off just so that we don't get confused as to which one is which. But as I take that off, now if I was to use the labor icon to go to my category for oil changes and then 5W30 full service oil change, when I click on OK, then now it dumps on not just the labor operation, but also that parts kit along with it as well. So again, it brings that over along with it.